Hello, I'm Asad Liaquat, and this is Unpacking Us. Pakistan has been hit by catastrophic floods. When I was recording the first episode of this podcast with Asim Khwaja, we couldn't imagine in our worst nightmares that the next episode would be about a disaster of such epic proportions. I talked to Asim after releasing that episode, and we both shared a feeling of unease about that episode. Because while the balance of payments crisis is an important problem, it pales in significance and relevance compared to the floods. I have two more episodes in the pipeline with Fiza Sajjad on the urban housing crisis and with Sarah Khan on the gender gap in voting, and I'll release them in due time, but today we'll talk about flood recovery. It's hard to wrap our minds around the sheer scale of the damage that has been caused by these floods. Satellite images show that more than a third of the country is underwater. Most of Pakistan's cropland and livestock seem to have been destroyed. 33 million people are reported to have been affected, and more than 1,200 have died. A recent estimate by the Atlantic Council's Uzair Yunus and by Amar Khan pins the damages at $13 billion, with $7 billion of them occurring in Sindh province alone. This estimate and others can help us come to terms with the scale of the problem, and in the hands of the right people can be put to use in relief and recovery efforts. But by and large, we simply don't know enough at the local level about where people have been most affected, and what are the ways in which they have been affected, what they need most, and when. My guest today is Tahir Andrabi. He's a professor of economics at Pomona College. He was the inaugural dean of the LUMS School of Education, an institution he built up from the ground. I've known him for 11 years now. He's been a mentor to me. I have traveled with him in rural Faisalabad and Kasur and Khairpur and the goats of Karachi. I've learned a lot from him, not just about economics, but also about ghalib and about how to cook mutton karahi the right way. It's his research on education that has achieved the most prominence, but the reason I'm talking to him today is his work on disaster recovery in the aftermath of the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan. Along with Jishnu Das and Asim Khwaja and others, he set up RisePak, which was an information aggregation portal to coordinate disaster relief following the earthquake. I'll talk to him about what we can learn from that experience to help us recover from the current floods in the weeks and months to come. He has also published research on the long-term effects of the earthquake on the lives of those who suffered most from the earthquake. And I'll talk to him about what we can learn from that to try and avert negative long-term outcomes for those who have been affected by these floods. Tahir, welcome to Unpacking Us.
Thank you, Asad. It's great to be here, even though what brings us together is a very sobering event, a catastrophe, but it's important to talk about it and really think about how to move forward.
So I want to start by thinking about what happens in the aftermath of a disaster like a flood or an earthquake. Based on your experience in the 2005 earthquake, how would you characterize the various stages of recovering from a disaster like this? And what stage are we in right now?
So typically when disaster professionals think about organizing effort, they talk about four phases. And the phases are really the 4 Rs. There is rescue, there is relief, there is rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So rescue is the immediate, right? What is called the first responders. So the first responders have to act very quickly. So this is where the pictures that you see on the internet of people being rescued from within these raging waters and so on, and getting them to kind of safe places. Safe places could be like camps, could be more dry ground. A lot of people would go to organized settings, but many people kind of go to friends and family in the Pakistani context, where they are the first in the first phase. The interesting, really, question is Pakistanis, particularly in rural areas, are very tied to their land, and so getting them to move even out of harm's way, can be a challenge. We saw that in the earthquake. Now that could be, Asad, you're a political economist. I mean, that could be because of insecure property rights or just a familial kind of a claim to the land. But I think there are some challenges in rescue. Now, in the rescue part, what you need is particular type of resources, right? I mean, it depends on whether we need helicopters or how localized the problem is. People need to be moved over further directions and all that? My sense is that in Pakistan right now, even though the rising water has still not finished going through the whole Indus basin, there will still be an impetus for rescue. But I think that the rescue phase is coming to an end very soon. And there we get into the next phase, which is relief. Now, relief is I think where we are either we are already there or just getting into it. So the phase there, and relief is where you really think you have taken people out of imminent harm right away, and then what do you have to do with them? Well, I mean, you have to provide them, the basics. The basics are a few food and nutrition. You need to be able to get to them that, and then shelter, and then you got to get in the food and nutrition. You got to think about like clean water. You got to think about like hygiene. I mean, how are you going to set it up? Are people going to do it on their own, in the sense that you provide them some resources and you let them figure it out, or are you going to provide them in some coordinated, centralized manner, and so on? Are you going to provide them tents? Are you going to provide them sheets or shelter? Different geographies have different needs. Some might be we're in the middle of the summer, so some places could be really hot. Others are more in the mountains. So I think the rehabilitation part really requires a resource base and coordination, which is quite different from the rescue part. Rescue part is where you need these superheroes to rescue. With rehabilitation, you are getting now more into kind of basic organization of relief, and it brings in many more challenges, even though the numbers may not be that dramatic, right? I mean, the loss of life is not going to happen, but what you can do is have a big impact on kind of more the hidden, invisible deaths that may not be attributable to floods, but could be attributable to disease, or you could further aggravate situations like chronic malnourishment or hunger and so on. So I think that's where we are right now.
Thinking about the various organizational aspects of the relief and recovery stages, the task seems fairly complicated. There are a lot of actors involved. There are various government agencies at various levels. There are NGOs, there are foreign donors, there are individual actors, and then there's very localized kind of community efforts. And these actors need to know what's needed, where it's needed, and when it's needed, and what others are doing so that they don't end up doing the exact same thing in the exact same place. To what extent is this kind of information or data available, and how important is it to these relief and recovery stages?
So data is always a problem. So Pakistan, the data resource required for organizing a proper, a nationwide, large scale rehabilitation effort, and then later on a reconstruction effort, or thinking about compensation or getting the economy going in these regions or areas, is lack of microdata.
So, who has this data, and why is it not being aggregated and used?
Well, NADRA has some information, but not all. The Census Bureau has information on Mozzas and population and some idea about housing structures. The Ag Census has something, but one of my big bugaboos in terms of all of this coordination is try merging the Ag Census with the population census. Not something easy to do. I mean, I spent all my life trying to do these kind of things. Then Suparco has some information. Pakistan Army uses its own maps. I worked a lot with Pakistan Army which was the dominant relief force in the 2005 earthquake. We did a survey 5 years later, and basically the Army covered about 95% of the people. They were the main one, but they have their own mapping system, and that's not shared by the general public. The mapping system used by the rest of us is by this authority which has the monopoly on it, called the Surveyor General of Pakistan. Now, the Surveyor General of Pakistan, I mean, I don't want to name names here, but it just looks like an authority which is way behind, right? It's certainly not a 21st century agency. So my point is that organizing something at the micro level, really even trying to ascertain losses and then where to go, and is a very serious task. And I just don't think we have learned anything from the earthquake and invested in that. And I think that that's something that it's a problem for all of us. And the whole idea of creating these organizations out of the earthquake experience, out of the Federal Relief Commission at the era, things like NDMA, the National Disaster Management Association, is also to be the coordinating body who does something like that. My sense is that they are really focusing a lot on rescue and relief. Going beyond rescue and relief, when we go into rehabilitation, what is the structure of governance and organizational structure within the state that is going to manage it? I think we need to get very quickly working on that right now. If somebody is already not working, they should be.
So that completely resonates with me in terms of the rehabilitation stage, but also in terms of the relief stage, because what we're seeing now is a lot of actors collecting funds, collecting in-kind donations to try to get relief to the right places, but we don't have a centralized clearinghouse to figure out where the need is the highest. And so it is going to be useful at that stage too. But from what you're describing and from what we know about what's happening on the ground, it doesn't seem like we have very good, efficient allocation of these resources right now.
You're absolutely right, Asad. I mean, I think that the problems of organizing relief and then organizing rehabilitation kind of meld into each other, right? I mean, they are not like these are. By the way, these are not like independent, hard and fast stages, right?
Sure.
I mean, there is a lot of fuzziness. A lot of relief is really becomes part of rehabilitation, and a lot of rehabilitation really has to work backwards into towards the relief part. I fully agree. I think that in relief it might be the problem. The problem is more acute, right? Because people do need relief in a much more time sensitive way. Where at least rehabilitation, maybe perhaps they can wait a little bit in terms of the dire need. So I agree. I mean, I think that we just don't know enough.
Okay, so let's start getting into the weeds a little bit more. What exactly would you like to know, and how exactly would that help both kind of organizations and individuals who are trying to help?
The problem is in Pakistan, what we need is a lot of information which is decentralized. So, I am bombarded, as you are, as is everybody else, by saying, well, tell us what are more credible organizations that give on the ground, right? I mean, there's the usual suspects. Well, of course, everybody loves AZ. Yeah, sure, if somebody asks me, should I give money to AZ Foundation? I would say, yes, yeah, please do. Given their track record and all that. However, I have no idea, where AZ is going. I mean, where is it, what district are they going? I don't even know that. Forget the district. Pakistani districts, you got to remember, right? Pakistani districts are very large. Okay. Pakistani districts and a typical Pakistani district, there's like what, 120, 130 districts in a country of 200 million people, right? So each district is close to like 1.5 million to 2 million people, right? On the average, of course, right? Lahore and urban areas are bigger. But having said that, these are very large expanses, lots and lots of households and people. I'd like to know where people are going. It would be very nice, for AD. I'm using AD because they're a credible organization. For AD to tell us very specifically, this is with as much geographical detail, which ideally it would be with the database mapped onto a digital map. Where I could actually click, right? So, I mean, I would like to know if I want to say the following. I have some background in Sindh, let's say, and I would say, I'd like to give in one of the talukas of Khairpur district. Okay. Well, how do I know where to give? Where is going? I mean, what might happen? What you worry about, and this is generally true for aid, is that aid will go where it is convenient to give aid, where it is easier to give aid. So what you want to make sure is that the people who actually need it. So what you really worry about is that some places getting a lot of relief, lots of blankets, lots of tents, lots of food packages, and others not. And I think that the only way to do it is to do it kind of a ground level stuff. So one of the things we did in Rise Park is to create this website, and through a lot of work, managed to convince some of the biggest providers of relief, including Pakistan Army, including the UN World Food Program, and including some of the large private NGOs like Islamic Relief and many others. We got about 75 organizations to sign up, okay, on that. It took a lot of work, but not that much. It took 2 weeks.
Can you take a step back and tell us about what Rice Park was?
Yeah, I think I should. I get carried away by this whole thing because I think that what you need is to mobilize people. Okay, so what Rice Park did is recognize this fundamental complication in this whole problem. So the fundamental complication is that what you need is a lot of decentralized information. What you need is a lot of centralized information. I'm an economist, so both from the supply side, which is where the providers are going. I need to know what villages are uncovered, what villages where there was more loss, was more aid provided. So that's on the supply side. But then how do I know? So I need to know where the providers go. But then at the same time, I need the demand side. I need to know the demand side, which villages have the highest need.
Right.
Is there pockets of small groups of people? Remember, villages also have settlements. I mean, the villages is a complex spatial structure. So what we need is both this information decentralized. What we need is for villagers to be able to think in terms of uploading information as to what the status is right now. Hey, we are village number Chuck number 236 in a particular district in southern Punjab, and we last received some aid here 2 weeks ago, some relief. It was in the form of blankets, some food, but what we really need are tents, and perhaps what would be nice is to be able to get some clothing or clean water. And that's an information that needs to come up. And what Rice Park did is facilitated that at different levels. We managed to make a deal with, I think it was with one of the largest cell phone companies at that time. Remember, we were back when the technology was not very good. Which is that people could text. And people could text, and there would be an automatic GPS kind of a code on that.
Right.
So that would go up. So I think that's what you need. Now, that's a decentralized. There is no way you will be able to get the demand level heterogeneity unless it's done in a decentralized way. And also, the relief providers have to have a full understanding of where it was. So, for example, in the UN, when we talked to the UN, which was World Food Program, was the one which was coordinating with government agencies to provide these food packages, which is a big part of relief. When we asked them as to what was going on in terms of the coverage, they did not have any data below the district. Right? Wow. I mean, even though the people on the ground did, right? People in the ground were working with whatever information they had, but there was no way if I would call World Food Program and I say, here I am, I have now truckloads of aid that I have organized. I know you guys are providing somewhere. Tell me where to go.
Right.
Well, I think that question has to be answered.
But how does that question get answered? And what's the underlying systematic reason that this question isn't already being answered?
So there is what we would call in the language of economics a market failure here. But that is the coordination. The aggregation part, I think, is a technical problem. I think that's the easiest part to solve. Right? I mean, where, how is this stuff aggregated and then reported back to people? So we need that. But I think the coordination part of how do you get all these different people to sign up? And I think that's part of, there has to be a wing in like NDMA or something, with the National Disaster Association Authority, which is thinking in what Asim Khaja, my partner in this, and Jishnu Das, my third partner, and we have been working on this stuff forever, what we call systems level thinking, which is what you really need to understand is what systems level thinking, in our view, is it understands that you need to empower actors who are working in this decentralized setting, but you need to solve their problem and their frictions and the problem they face A lot of it is this coordination problem. That to me is what the organizational structure around relief needs to look like.
So I couldn't agree more with you that the technical problem is far easier to solve, especially in, given the technological progress that has happened since the earthquake. I can very easily imagine the technical infrastructure being set up in a matter of days if somebody were to do it. But it is the coordination problem, getting the right actors to adopt this system such that it does become this kind of useful lifeblood of the relief and rehabilitation efforts. That would be the challenge. So now let's think about if someone were to try to put a rice park equivalent together for these floods, what would that take? And how would you think about trying to solve this coordination problem?
I think that has to be done at the level of the agencies. Okay. So, I would get, so one is this whole data information people. That's NADRA. There is, the Census Bureau. We actually got them together. We managed to convince the Federal Relief Commission to create a wing in which, each organization would have a representative who was empowered to share this information, and we would create this common data. It's not that hard. I would say you need about 15 to 20 people in a room. We need the mapping people, the satellite people, the census people. Think about that, right? I mean, and then, we need some young people who start telling us, how to use this light data, satellite data, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever is the modern techie version of the, I'm still thinking of 20th century or early 21st. But whatever that equivalent is, I don't think it's that hard to create a system. Then you get the media on board. You have to get the telcos in there, right? I mean, the telephone companies. I think they are
Right.
central to, in the modern day and age. I would say if we can get cell phones which send text messages with an automatic GPS tag to it, saying what we need. Just think about it. You make an announcement right now, Asad, and tell people, hey, wherever you are, right, tell us what you need. Crowdsource that information, but it has to be geotagged, so I know exactly where you're coming from. And we can standardize that information as to what format it takes. We can do that. It's not. It can take us. All of this can be done. I tell you in a day, right? And that information, when it's standardized, then you have a centralized place where that information can be aggregated and then spewed out to the people. But then you have to then map it. If you want to really start getting into the rehabilitation phase, reconstruction phase, you have to start mapping it into the other data forms. You can merge it with, you're a political economist, with the election commission data, so you can start getting the politicians. And just imagine if all of this information is conveyed to a politician in a particular constituency, and I go and say, hey, in your constituency, right, I have 3,000 people who are without blankets, or I have 200 people who need some vaccination, or there has been some outbreak of some epidemic. So I think all of that, right? So I don't think it's a pipe dream. I think it's eminently doable.
Doable by whom?
I think the initial impulse has to come from people who are activists. This is what I tell all my students, which is, you can be an activist in terms of mobilizing for aid. But I think that you need your comparative advantage. I'm not Bill Gates. My comparative advantage is not money. I'm not going to give a lot of people, right? Like Tim Cook said, 160 million. Well, most people in Pakistan can't give 160 million. They can't even give anything, right? I mean, what are you going to give? Not much. But you do have this technical expertise. And my sense is what you need to do is to be able to work on some part of this data side. Listen, this is serious stuff. This is not just about saying, hey, let's take a truck out there and distribute some blankets. I mean, this is now creating a modern infrastructure for a serious policy response.
No, absolutely. And I think, this serves as an inspiration for people who are listening in too, to think about ways to contribute beyond just donating. And I should point out that some of these estimates that I gave you earlier about, the $13 billion in damages, they are coming from young people who are trying to put together some of, the best available information that's out there to try to put together estimates of the damages. But they haven't yet been able to do that at a decentralized enough level such that it's useful to be able to direct our efforts in a meaningful way?
So, Asad, I think this is a very good example. I really should, as you did, acknowledge these efforts. I think this could be a nice working group, right? I mean, think about different working groups, right? When you say how can people contribute, a working group would be, let's think seriously about how would you estimate the damage, right? I mean, think about how would you do livelihoods. Each one of
Right.
them is a pretty serious problem. It's not a simple problem. They're not trivial problems. They're not back of the envelope problems. Okay. So my sense is, I would take that 13 billion, take that methodology, and come up with some sort of methodology where if I could then translate into some decentralized crowd effort.
And should we think about this decentralized effort in the very short run, or does this kind of effort extend beyond the immediate aftermath of the flood?
Let's put it this way. If somebody is listening right now and says, well, I want to think about it, but before I can really contribute, it's going to take me 4 or 5 years of work. I'll tell you, when the next flood happens, you'll be ready. We're not doing it just for this flood. We are setting up the infrastructure. And what I mean is like the human, the intellectual infrastructure to deal with these things as they keep on coming. I mean, it's not just about this. So Pakistan may, the point is what I'm worried about is, the earthquake, by the way, right, really brought the country together. So, we do know that Pakistan, this whole idea that Pakistanis can unite for a common cause, they did at that time. And even, back at that time too, right? I mean, there was a dictatorship, there was lots, all kinds of problems. But we did. People from all over Pakistan, every province, contributed. And I think that Pakistanis do feel it. So I think it will happen. But what I'm worried about is when the sense of emergency dies down, these people will go back into some sort of invisibility and, become like IDPs or something and, off the news cycle. Well, what's going to happen to your sense of jazba or this motivation, right? So this idea of this motivation, which is driven by the disaster, I think has a pretty serious half-life. And what I want is to put some structures in place. And I can only talk about the structures that I know of, which is this infrastructure that we talked about.
Right. And I think what you said about this not being a one-off thing really resonates, because climate disasters are going to happen again and again in Pakistan. Pakistan is, by some estimates, maybe the 7th or the 6th most affected country by climate change in the years to come. And so these aren't going to be the last big floods in Pakistan. We're going to have more and more of these disasters, and then building up that resilience in the long term such that we're ready the next time is going to be super important.
I think you're right? I mean, you said about Ghalib. Let me just say, right? Ghalib said, "Mujhe kya bura tha marna agar ek baar hota." Right? Yeah, it's not going to happen once. And I think what we need to do is to say this is the new normal. And this idea that the canonical model of thinking about Pakistan is Pakistani households, Pakistani polity, Pakistani society, Pakistani economy living under all continual, not continuous, but continual shocks. I think that's what we are. I mean, we are living in a world which is going to be volatile.
I want to come back to thinking about the effects of these floods. As we move into the next stage of flood relief, we need to think about how to sustain the livelihoods, the health, the education of those affected, and what are the best interventions or policy levers to do that. You have done research on the long-term effects of the 2005 earthquake on health and education outcomes in particular. In light of that research, what would your recommendation be here?
Yeah, I think that the first thing is the following. Okay, so money does help. Okay, let's not kid ourselves. I know people are worried about fiscal space and all of this and stuff on Pakistan right now. But to get the economy moving and to get livelihoods back in place, there's got to be transfers to these people. Because remember, from Sen onwards, talking about famines and all that, one of the big issues is that there is a loss of purchasing power in these places. It's not just a supply, it's not just asset loss, it's also livelihoods and income. So, what we need to do is to make sure there is income goes back into the hands of these people. because that's what they can start spending. And I'm not just talking about from a welfare point of view, but from a systems point of view, because then they can start spending, and the spending gets the market going. And when the market starts going, that's where what you do not want is shortages, and what you do not want is inflationary pressures in this economy, right? I mean, if there are shortages, then everybody will need a lot more stuff to come in. So what you want to do is to get, so the government's job is to make sure that they get rid of the supply bottlenecks. So goods can go in. I'm talking about all kinds of goods. And Pakistani market, you go to, I mean, I was in the summer in Kalam, I mean, at ground zero right now, and you go to 14,000 feet, and there's a guy there selling frost. Okay. And I'm thinking, how the hell did you get it up there? There's no road or anything, right? So the commercial penetration of Pakistan is pretty high. So I think that's one. So let's not kid ourselves. To get, build back better, get the economy moving, all of that, I think there has to be a program. It can be targeted, we can do it through BISP, or we can do it through, classic, I would say unconditional cash transfers of some sort have to take place. If we think that we can get out of this without it, no. So let's not, right? I mean, that's got to be the second phase. Now, whether, under this IMF program, all of this, maybe we need a separate aid for it, but we need to create a proposal. What I don't like is people asking for aid and everything else without having a plan. I think that what I would like to do is to make a plan which has sufficient detail and is feasible operationally, and then we take it to the world to fund it. I think people are much more willing. I mean, just as we write proposals, we know that, right? People are much more willing to fund us if they think we have a pretty good idea of what we're trying to do. And I think we need to create a full plan for that. So that's one. The problem is money is not enough. There are some problems that money can solve, but others it can't. And that's really the hard part about these disasters. And I'll give you one example from my research, which is probably the most striking thing I've ever encountered in my own fieldwork and research, which is that we always like to think that Pakistanis are resilient. Even the Prime Minister used the word, right? This is a favorite word in Pakistan. Oh, Pakistanis are resilient. They will get back. Well, they do get back. You look at post-earthquake, and you look at infrastructure in the earthquake-affected areas, it's more or less at par with places that did not get the earthquake. And in some dimensions, it's even better because this whole build back better. You build better buildings. You build better homes. If you look at the schooling, which I look at a lot, even enrollment is back to normal. Household consumption is back to normal. So, in all of those dimensions, it looks like it's a success, right? So we know how to do it. So so in that part, right, I mean, there is the micro detail about the immediacy of who to get. And if you want to be more efficient in terms of, giving money in some targeted way, though I would say, be loose. Don't be too targeted. But where it doesn't come into play is these health shocks for very young children, and in particular of children who are in utero. Right? So this is the irony, right? That the most affected are the people who are not even born yet. I mean, I just saw a news report saying, it was UNFPA or some UN agency was estimating how many pregnant women are in these affected areas. It's like 500,000 or something. I think in utero shocks are very strong, and they affect. They are very long term, and later investments cannot compensate for them. So if you get an in utero shock, your mother, for example, becomes malnourished for an extended period during her pregnancy, you will be born with low birth weight, significantly low birth weight. And that low birth weight, your brain development in the first 3 years will really suffer. Your physical development will really suffer, and you are behind. I mean, in the earthquake area, everything is recovered, but one of the most visibly distressing things that I saw, I went there, first 4 years later, and then I went there like 9 years later, was stunting. I mean, you see kids who are really stunted. Now, stunting means you're basically gone for life. I mean, your outcomes are bad. So in utero, I would say, first things first, get a program going where you start counting, figuring out where these pregnant women are. That's number one. Because those kids, if there is significant nutritional loss in the mother, those kids are going to be scarred for life. That's one. Second is our research said, look at what is called the first 1,000 days. So in utero is the most important. Then people who are newborn, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and then 2 to 3. This is called the first 1,000 days. I would say focus on young children there. I mean, if I have to create a priority, I would create a program for mothers and their children, because that's protecting the next generation, because those are going to be permanent shocks. Later on, if you give them money 2 years later, 3 years later, it's not going to help. That money is needed now. So I think that if there is in this rehabilitation phase, I would say if there is a sense of emergency, I would say on the economy side, pump in some cash so that these people can stay afloat and they don't die, right? You don't want people to start dying, right? I mean, I'm sure there's too much pressure for food transfers, but I would give some income transfers also, and then focus on this nutritional program and supplements for young children. Because that research, our research has clearly shown, and we have published it, it's been discussed a lot, so it's pretty robust, that's really where the problem is.
What about learning losses?
Yeah, that's something that I am working on right now. So this is the issue in learning right now. When schools close for an extended period of time, kids fall behind. When they come back, if you continue as if nothing had happened, and you don't recalibrate either your pedagogy or instruction or the curriculum or how you do it, or have a program, specific program that works with parents, with teachers, you have to recalibrate the system. If you don't do it, these losses can become permanent. Then again, you have a lost generation. You have these people who come up with very few skills. So think about it across the age spectrum. With very young kids, you have this really physical developmental issue, which is the most serious. As kids get older, they don't suffer physically developmentally because the brain, most development has happened, but there's a serious loss of skills. This is on top of extended school closures because of COVID. We already are coming up with like 18 months to 24 months of school closures. And we were just going to start right now after, Eid, after 14th of August, schools were opening. And boom, we are back in this crisis again. So think about a kid who was 5 years old, 4 years old, 6 years old, in March 2020, when schools shut down. The kid is 8 right now. And certainly, it means over the last 2.5 years, the kid has not gone to school at all. Now, if you think about most of these kids, the digital divide really comes in. If your parents are well off and are motivated and are capable and have the resources or the awareness, whatever you want to call it, they can compensate for these losses by doing things at home. And you go to a rich private school, you get all this internet homework, blah blah blah. But for the poor kids, they don't have any books at home. They have no resource support material. So what you really have to worry is about catch up. So I think in the long run, the irony is that in COVID we were worried about that the mortality of the older people is the most. Well, the reality is that one of the biggest burdens is going to be fall on the young people. So Pakistani adults recover. Pakistani children may not. And that's the real emergency. The real emergency is not this roaring floods. The real emergency is that little kid some mom is carrying in her goal, and what to do about it. And you're going to see not just an effect now, but perhaps over the entire lifetime of that kid. So we need to make sure that these kids we get education going back there. We need to take care, right? I mean, what's public policy? It's about taking care of the most vulnerable people in society, right? I mean, we got to identify those, who they are. They can't be invisible because the poor are quite invisible. We don't even know where they are. We need to have this whole targeting mechanism. This is modern development economics. This is what I teach.
So, Tahir, I want to end by asking you for your personal recommendation on what podcast listeners can do to learn more about this, or what they can do to help out beyond donating.
Yeah, I think that, what is very interesting is that people face, in crises like this, people face or feel a lack of agency. And people feel a sense of powerlessness. Of what can we do? We can't do anything. My sense is what I really would like is for young people to really get to know Pakistan, get to know your country in some deep way, in some micro way, in some grassroots decentralized way. Go down, right? I don't care where. But it would be so nice that in response to these floods, if, Pakistan, by the way, right, in the census data has close to 50,000 villages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How many villages can we write a village report on? I don't care whether it's now for relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction. How many people are listening? I mean, if we say that in the next 2 years, we would start getting these crowdsourced village reports on all these villages, right? As to what the status is, what the situation is. We can create some templates so that they are somewhat commonality to it. But I think that's what we need. I think people need to understand the world that they live in. Otherwise, I think that, with social media and the fact that we live in so many bubbles, that we really never get to the point of understanding the other, understanding the poor, understanding the vulnerable. We need to really face it. That's why I think fieldwork is so important. Coming face to face with a person, talking about their own life, talking about their own aspirations, talking about, what is it that has happened to these people who have gone through the flood. There is a whole, social science literature about it. I mean, just test it. Just go in with your priors, challenge them.
Tahir, this has been a sobering and an inspiring conversation at the same time. Thank you so much for being here.
Asad, thank you for inviting me, and I hope that we can have lots of these conversations.
Absolutely. You can find some links to what we talked about in this episode and to the recommendations made by our guest today in the show notes of this episode or on unpackingus.com. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this episode. Also, I'd love to hear what you like and don't like about the show, and if you have any ideas for future episodes. You can email me at asad@unpackingus.com. I can't promise to respond to every email, but I do promise to read and think about every email. Thank you for listening.